Now I'm pleased to introduce to some and present to others our presenter for today, Deborah Jackson.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Linda, for allowing us to gather and create this forum. Thank you, Judson Press. It's wonderful to welcome you all to this webinar, Spiritual Practices for Effective Leadership. Allow me to begin by offering a word of prayer. Would you pray with me? Gracious God, we give you thanks for this day. We thank you for allowing us to connect through technology, and we pray, oh God, that what is said, what is done, what is thought, what is offered is pleasing in your sight. Give us your grace, give us your wisdom, give us your ability to be in your presence, that we might feel you and know you for ourselves and for those that we lead. Through Jesus Christ we pray. Amen. As we said, I'm Deborah Jackson, and I'm making sure that I get this in my mode and I can lead the presentation. And let me tell you about myself to help facilitate our conversation today. I'm the Executive Director of the Ministers Council of the American Baptist Churches, USA. And for those that are not familiar with the Ministers Council, we are a nonprofit, autonomous, multicultural organization of ordained clergy, lay leaders, and seminarians who are serving American Baptist churches. And our purpose as the Ministers Council is to provide programming and support for our members, helping them to be more effective in their ministries and in their community. Prior to my call as the Executive Director of the Ministers Council, I was the Senior Pastor of the First Baptist Church in Needham, Massachusetts. I was the first woman and first African American to be called the Senior Pastor of this historic 150-year-old church. Prior to my call, God was preparing me for ministry through my business and academic experiences. I started my career as a software engineer many years ago and had the privilege of leading software teams internationally as we served a number of Fortune 500 clients in software development. I ended my corporate career as a Chief Information and Chief Operating Officer of an energy services technology company where we were innovating software solutions and an e-commerce strategy to support thousands of customers. I was also working as an independent consultant and doing work with for-profit and nonprofit organizations, working in organizational redesign, strategic planning, and professional development. Academically, I hold a doctorate in ministry with my concentration being in leadership. I have master's degrees in divinity, manufacturing engineering, and engineering management, and my bachelor's degree is in business. So all of these experiences come together in writing my book, Spiritual Practices for Effective Leadership, the 7 R's of Sanctuary for Pastors. Yes, my expertise is in leadership, but valuing practical application. I wanted to take the best of leadership theory and the foundation of my faith to develop a process that would minister to leaders in revelatory ways. That's what my book does, and I'm thrilled to have this afternoon to share with you some of my learning. So, starting us off, I actually have a question, and that question is this: can your time apart to engage in spiritual practices increase your effectiveness in leadership? Now, you know this would be a very short webinar if I said no. So of course, yes, it can. And I want to spend some time telling you how. But to set the context, we need to unpack terms a bit. See, the core focus of this question is on leadership, because I asked you, can your time apart to engage in spiritual practices increase your effectiveness in leadership? So my question actually begs another question, which is, what is leadership? See, I'm borrowing from Ron Heifetz here, and I believe that leadership is that adaptive capacity to motivate teams to come together to learn in ways that enable them to make progress on challenges that confront them as congregations or organizations or teams. See, in this definition of leadership, effectiveness is not solely based on the leader and his or her ability to get something done, but the leader's ability to motivate other people to be engaged so that they can affect the change that is necessary. Now, I understand that this might be a sort of a different way of looking at leadership, because most of us are accustomed to that larger than life leader, the John Wayne type that says, hey, let's take that hill, and leads the charge, or maybe in the context of the church, that strong pastor who says, I know what needs to be done, I know how to do it, and let's go do it. And that's a great leadership model. It serves us and has served us for quite some time. But the problems that are confronting us now as churches, as organizations, they're not so easily solved by that strong leader who has all the answers. I mean, think about it. Most of our churches are dealing with the pervasive issue of decline. What do we do to confront decline in the church, confront the fact that we're missing generations of people in the church? If we knew how to answer that question, we would have answered it, we would have solved it, but we don't, and that's why we're still struggling with some of those same problems. So instead of the leader being all-knowing, the leader needs to bring other voices and other perspectives to the table, and then create the environment where everybody can participate. And what that means is we come together, we share, and we learn so that together we have a better sense of what needs to be done, and we can go forth as a team and do it. It's not the leader saying, hey, let's take the hill. It's the leader orchestrating, directing the voices, melding them together, which means creating that kind of holding environment where change can occur. So if that's the definition of leadership, and if that's what the charge is in being effective as leaders, what is it that we must do specifically? Well, to be effective, the leader must use emotional intelligence. It's about emotional intelligence. Now, what is that? In his book, Primal Leadership, Daniel Goleman discusses a neurological response of the human limbic system. So this is your emotional center in your brain, and what ends up happening externally impacts us internally as it's processed through the limbic system. And what it means is when we're engaging one another, when we're in conversation, we sort of catch the emotions of the other. If the person that's speaking is excited, we get excited. If the person that's speaking is sort of sad, we start to get sad. And that happens just in everyday conversation. So think about it. If you're the leader and this is happening in everyday conversation, just think of what your impact, what your emotional state is doing to that of your team, your congregation, or your organization. Your state affects how other people feel, and as a leader, it also affects how other people perform. So what that means is our challenge as leaders is to create resonance, that positive ability to stimulate people so that they can catch our emotions and be motivated and excited and energized right along with us. By using our emotional intelligence, we cultivate an atmosphere of cooperation and trust while generating excitement and optimism for the job ahead. So that's one piece. We've got to have emotional intelligence to be effective. But that's only one piece. A second component of our effectiveness is predicated on our ability to be self-differentiated. Effective leaders are self-differentiated. What does that mean? We have to be clear about who we are, our goals, our purpose, and the work that we're called to do in order to remain rooted and grounded in the midst of challenges. You see, when an organization or a congregation or team is facing challenges, the stress of those challenges can create anxiety. And I've already explained this idea of the limbic system, how we catch one another's emotions. If your congregation or your team or your organization is anxious, you as the leader become susceptible to that anxiety as well. But if we are to maintain that non-anxious presence, then what we have to do is be emotionally connected while individually distinct. And that's the way that we can be that purveyor of calm in the midst of any situation. We have to be self-differentiated to be effective in our leadership. Now, when you think about all of that, already I've created this tall order, because what it says is to be effective as leaders, we must be able to bring people together and motivate them to adaptively learn by creating that holding environment for the team in which we as the leader uses our emotional intelligence to engage people, because that's the kind of environment coupled with our positive resonance that provides the motivating pressure to help people make progress on the challenges that confront them. But then to keep from being anxious in the midst of that environment, we as leaders have to be self-differentiated in order to be that non-anxious presence. It's a lot to do. It's a tall order. And the question is, do you know how to do all of that? You know, when I think about it, it's more than a notion, but it's something that we can manage because it's a reflective process. And that reflective process is what helps us to be effective. See, what happens in a reflective process is that we take action, right? And then when we take action, we're sort of reflecting on that action, which means that we're sort of consciously analyzing what we've done and how we've done it. And then we evaluate what we've done and how we've done it in order then to refocus our actions so that we can more effectively move forward. That's the process, and whether you think about doing that or not, that's the process. I mean, whether we're baking a cake or riding a bike, we're sort of doing these course corrections, whether we're cognizant of it or not, in order to figure out how we would do something better. And that makes sense. Again, when I think about some of my research conversation partners, I think of Chris Argyris and Donald Schoen, who wrote the book Theory of Practice, Increasing Professional Effectiveness, and they insisted that all human beings need to be competent in taking an action and simultaneously reflecting upon that action in order to learn from it. And see, it's that kind of reflective process that helps us to improve what we do and how we do it going forward. Because you see, as we engage in reflection, what we're really doing is creating perspective for ourselves. We're creating some distance between ourselves and the challenges that confront us, which helps us to be more objective in our reasoning. And when we increase our objectivity, what we're really doing is increasing our mental capacity to be able to more expansively consider the options that might be in front of us. And so as we reflect, we increase our effectiveness because that reflective practice helps us to learn. And in the learning, we can move faithfully forward. Now, but when I think about what is reflective practice or a reflective process, I would contend that it's really a spiritual practice. Think about what you're doing when you're in that reflective practice. First, what you're doing is you're thinking about, who do I want to be? I mean, what's my ideal? And then how do I measure up against that ideal? And if there's a gap between what I see as the ideal and who I am today, then what I really am trying to do in this analysis, evaluation kind of step is figure out, how do I lessen that gap? What do I need to do? And that's really going to dictate a learning agenda, if you will, to figure out, how do I become more like my ideal? And as I exercise that learning agenda, I'm going to achieve goals, making progress, becoming more like my ideal. And if I really want to cement the change, then what I'm going to do is I'm going to engage other people. I'm going to tell people that I'm trying to do this. And then they can be a community of support for me in making the change possible. So that's sort of what we do when we go through this reflective process. Well, think about what you do when you engage in spiritual practices. The first step as you look at a spiritual practice is, who do I want to be? Well, as followers of Jesus Christ, our ideal is Jesus. I want to be more Christ-like in my life. And I look at who I am now and where I am, and what is it going to take then for me to be Christ-like. So again, I start to look at, what kinds of things do I need to do? What kind of practices do I need to put in place to find my life more in conformance with that of Jesus Christ? Do I need to study my Bible? Do I need to be in prayer? Do I need to meditate? What is going to make me more Christ-like? And as I take on those practices, I'm achieving my goals. I'm getting closer to my ideal. And again, if I really want to submit the change, I bring others into my circle to journey along with me and be supportive. So really, the reflective process is identical to what we do in spiritual practice. But more importantly than what we call that, we can look at what happens for us as we engage in these spiritual practices. See, I would contend that as we take time apart for spiritual practices, we grow because our lives are conformed to Christ. And then we're grounded in God in the midst of our spiritual practice, which helps us to restore our well-being. And because our time apart for spiritual practice serves to restore our sense of purpose, who we are, whose we are, even as we are being restored in our well-being, we're strengthened in ministry and we're strengthened in our leadership. But understand that spiritual practices are more than just a nice to do, nice to have, something that we should get around to because it's good for us. Spiritual practices are actually commended to us in the Bible. Now think about it from Exodus 31 and 17. I love this passage because God is reminding Moses that people are to observe Sabbath, that divine time set aside and sanctified by God for solemn rest and restoration. And God reminded Moses that in 6 days God created the heavens and the earth, but in the seventh day, that was the day of rest. But here's the kicker. The effect of Sabbath rest for God was that God was refreshed. Rabbinic scholars will tell us that the Hebrew word for refreshed is derived from a noun that speaks to a person's life essence, their vitality or essential character. And by ceasing from work and resting, God experienced this infusion of spiritual and physical vigor to the extent that God was revived in God's entire being. This is not me saying this. This is the rabbinic scholar Rashi from the 1000 or 1200 has been saying this, that God received a new soul in the midst of Sabbath rest, which to me is amazing, because God who needs nothing receives a new soul. And if God receives a new soul, what then must that rest do for us? But we see it also as we look at Jesus, because Jesus took great deals of time alone, ebbing in and out of ministry for spiritual practice. We see in the Gospels, Mark 6 and Luke 6, that Jesus prayed before and after ministry. And you might remember these narratives. Jesus left the crowd after feeding them late at night, seeking time apart to pray in the mountains. Jesus withdrew to deserted places to pray, as Luke 5 and John 6 talks about, and he used that time to be sustained and refreshed in ministry. In decision-making, Luke tells us that Jesus stayed up all night in the mountains praying to God before he chose the 12. And even in the Garden of Gethsemane, Matthew and Luke tells us that Jesus prayed for and received strength and comfort in the midst of stress as he was preparing to give himself for us on the cross. So how do you realize effective leadership? For effective leadership, we have to take time apart for spiritual practice of reflection. And in that reflection time, we're strengthened, refreshed, and restored, recognizing that in reflection, we gain the capacity to help teams adaptively learn by creating that holding environment, that crucible, if you will, in which we use our emotional intelligence to positively resonate with and engage people while remaining self-differentiated, emotionally connected, but individuated, so that through this model of leadership, we're orchestrating and we're helping teams get excited and learn so that they can make progress on the challenges that confront them. That's what makes you effective as a leader. And the 7 R's of Sanctuary is a process by which you can do just that. Now, before I launch into the process model, I wanted to pause and give anyone opportunity for questions if there are any. Hearing none and seeing none, then let me continue. So this is the process model for the 7 R's of Sanctuary. And what you see in this process model is that we begin from our leadership context, that left line of the R, and what we're doing, whether we're clergy or lay, whether we serve for nonprofit or for-profit entities, we can engage in the same practice where we step away from our leadership context to retreat, and then we release from the challenges of our context so that we can let go and disconnect. Then we review in a mindful way our current leadership context, and in parallel, reconnect with God's call and leading on our lives. That sets the stage for us to be able to reflect. which allows us to weave together our current context and call to identify the disconnections between what we're doing and what we feel led by God to do. That sets the stage for us to be able to recalibrate. That is, do that refocusing step where we identify strategies that'll help us narrow the gaps that we identified when we reflected. Then we can return to our leadership context, more grounded and ready to lead. That's the entire model, but let's look at each step one by one. Retreat is an invitation. It's an invitation to step away from your leadership context and create that isolated physical or mental space between you and your work. It reminds me of Jesus' invitation to the disciples as recorded in Mark 6:31. Jesus said to them, "Come away to a deserted place all by yourselves and rest a while." Retreat is the opportunity to step away in order to take time apart, to make space, to gain perspective. It's that recognition in the midst that we all need time to rest. The first R is that we retreat. Then we need to release. Release is the opportunity to slow down and engage in a period of dormancy. It's the opportunity to be, just be, rather than do. See, sometimes we're in need of the invitation that we hear and see in 1 Peter 5:7, which says, "Cast all of your anxieties on him because he cares for you." See, release is an unwinding process, a slowing down to do nothing. I remember speaking to leaders who talked about feeling guilty when they did nothing. But we forget the lesson of the bulb flower that lies dormant under the frozen ground all winter. That period of dormancy is just as important as a period of growth, because without quiescence or rest, plants can't reach their peak, and neither can we. We have to let go and clear mental and emotional space to realize God's care for us. Secondly, we have to release. Now, when you've retreated and released, and you've created an open and meditative space, now you can review. See, review is that invitation to mindfully consider your leadership context without condemnation. See, too often when we review, we become anxious because we allow it to be an exercise of indictment. What did I forget to do? Who did I forget to call? But here, mindfulness reminds us that we can review in this sort of open, expansive way, like watching puffy clouds go by. Where am I in my leadership? What's going well? What could be improved? Am I where I hoped to be? These questions for me are reminiscent of David in Psalm 18. The Message Bible renders it this way: God made my life complete when I placed all the pieces before him. When I got my act together, he gave me a fresh start. God rewrote the text of my life when I opened the book of my heart to his eyes. See, David saw himself as identifying the parts and pieces of his life and then offering them up to God. And God ordered his steps. When we review, we become aware of the full scope of our work. And then offering that work up to God, we're better able to discern God's leading and direction for our work. That's review. Now we want to reconnect. See, in this step of the process, we're invited to reconnect to God's call on your life. Remember God's call to Abram in Genesis 12? Now the Lord said to Abram, go from your country, go from your kindred and your father's house to a land that I will show you. See, that's a clear message of call. God said, go. But I know, having spoken to so many of our colleagues, that they have that same kind of clarity of call, hearing God in their life. Do you remember God's call on your life? Do you remember what God gifted and enabled you to do? Do you remember when God said go to you? See, when we reconnect, we remember that call, and sometimes we even remember the things that we heard God say but we haven't acted upon, and it's a time that we can rekindle the flame of dreams lost. We can also think about the goals and the ideas that God gave us. Maybe God called us to plant a church. Maybe God called us to go back to school. Maybe God called us to go on a mission trip. Whatever it was, reconnect is the time to dust off those plans, fan those flames, and consider where God is leading. Now, the fifth R invites us to weave what we've remembered in the tasks as we reviewed and what we remembered in the call that was reconnect, and weaving that together. See, what you're doing is you're looking forward at the current context. You're looking backward at the original call, the goals and ideals, and then you analyze. This is the weaving. You analyze what you're doing, evaluating it against what you were called to do, and then you refocus. That is, mentally hold those ideas together, recognizing the gaps and the disconnections between what you're doing and what God has called you to do. It's an invitation to reflect upon the faithfulness of God and remember that faithfulness to propel you, to propel me forward in our actions. Are you living out your call? Are you honoring the tasks that are necessary for your work? And how might remembering God's past faithfulness embolden you in your life to step out in your present and future work and ministry? That's what we do when we reflect. Then we recalibrate. Because you see, when you reflect, you're able to see the disconnects. But more than that, as you consider where there's disconnections and gaps between what you're doing and what you were called to do, what starts to emerge for us in the presence of God are ideas that help us regain our footing and get back on the right track. Because see, as Isaiah tells us, the Holy Spirit, when we're listening for the Spirit, will whisper in our ear saying, Psst, this is the way. Walk in it. And see, when you hear the voice of the Spirit, what you realize is that not every plan that emerges is the right one. So we need to sort of try on for size. That is, listen and discern the voice of the Spirit so we know the best way to go. Sense God's energy. When you think about a strategy that helps you get back on path, do you get excited or do you feel yourself sort of pulled away from it? Recognize that and lean into that as the means to help you faithfully move forward. Because really what we're trying to do is realign with God's plan for our life. Recognizing that as we listen for God's leading, we will receive some direction as the best path that's illumined for us. And at the same time, we want to rest in this practice and in this step, knowing that we find peace. We find peace as we find the path that is illumined for us. As David said, when the Lord is my shepherd, I want for nothing. And that gives us a sense of peace. And then finally, we get ready for the return. See, we've had this opportunity to step away from our leadership context. We've had this invitation to partake of restorative spiritual practices. And just doing that is a source of refreshment and strengthening in our ministry and for our lives. And as we've gone through the process, discerning God's voice and leading for us, oftentimes we emerge from this with recalibrated strategies in hand, knowing which way we go when we go back to our leadership context. And that gives us energy to get back into the game. So return gives us the opportunity to celebrate and appreciate the fact that we had time apart, that we gained perspective, and we have this renewed sense of purpose, an opportunity to rest with God and realize God's certainty and leading as we've been in God's presence. But we celebrate the calm that comes having this time apart. And you recognize, as you think about all that I've said thus far, that when we have this time of calm and grounding, what we're really doing is increasing our self-differentiation. And that allows us to get excited about returning. But guess what? When we get excited, that excitement is infectious and has the potential of being infectious to the people that we will deal with when we return to our leadership context. That means our emotional intelligence has increased as well. So you see where this is going, right? The 7 hours of sanctuary allows you to retreat from your ministry environment. It allows you to release from your challenges so that you can disconnect and review your current leadership context in this mindful way, which then allows you to reconnect in parallel with God's call on your life. But having reviewed and reconnected, you can weave together these strands of thought, reflecting and identifying the disconnections between your current context and your call. And when you can recognize those disconnections, you can recalibrate by determining strategies that will help you realign that into that illumined path that God has for you, and then celebrate the return, going back into your ministry, grounded and prepared to lead. And what emerges from this process is that you gain perspective and objectivity as you step away. You increase your self-differentiation as you're restored through spiritual practice. You're energized in the process, which increases your emotional intelligence, and you realize that generative capacity that helps you move faithfully forward, not just you, but the people that you lead. And you see, when you engage in the 7 R's of sanctuary, you realize effectiveness in your leadership, because it means that you've taken time apart for the spiritual practice of reflection. And that enhances your spiritual well-being, which makes it possible for you to effectively lead. That is, motivate teams to adaptively learn by creating that holding environment in which you will use emotional intelligence to engage people while remaining self-differentiated, which then allows you to help your team, your congregation, your organization make progress on confronting challenges. That's when we maximize our effectiveness, when we can do all of that. And you can do all of that. Do you want to learn more? Well, you can purchase my book. Yes, yes, it's a pitch. You can purchase my book, which is Spiritual Practices for Effective Leadership, the 7 R's of Sanctuary for Pastors. Judson Press is the publisher, and you can get it through judsonpress.com. And what's exciting about this is that the first part of the book, if you're not familiar with it, talks about this theory and unpacks the details of the leadership theory, about taking time apart, about Sabbath and Jesus's practices, and about spirituality and spiritual practice and what that does for us. But then the second part provides that experiential process, walking through the 7 R's, so that you can see how this can impact your life to become a way of life practice for you. So hopefully this time that we've had together in this webinar has whet your appetite and encouraged you perhaps to want to buy the book and learn more. But if you have questions, and certainly we want to make sure that there's time to entertain your questions, and we'll use the last few minutes of this webinar for that. But my contact information is there for you as well. You can send me email. You can also call me, and that's the toll-free number to reach me. You can also follow me on Twitter. And then finally, I would offer, before we open the floor for questions and comments, that through a generous grant, we've have the opportunity to put forward the 7 R's of Sanctuary program, which is actually a year-long praxis program through which you can learn the theory and then apply the experiential knowledge so that you can make this a way of life practice in your ministry, these 7 R's of Sanctuary. We just launched the first cohort, and they started with a 3-day retreat at the end of September, and then the year-long program will also consist of 3 more day-long sessions. We will start a second cohort in the spring of 2016, and we're seeking funding for additional cohorts. There is a small fee, but most of the fee, 75% of the expense of the program, is actually supported by scholarship. So you can always contact me to learn more information if you're interested in the cohort. So those are my questions. That's my time, and what I want to do and give us time to entertain your questions. And so Linda will help me with this part, but I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments, but this would be the time that we can share those now.
Deborah, we do have two questions that I see. And the first one is, do you tend to think of these as a rhythm that is optimal to repeat within a given time frame of human time, weekly, monthly, yearly, all of the above? And how would you order the discipline of this?
You know, that's a great question, and it was one of the real motivators for me when I started the research in this project and talking to other people. And I really wanted to see this sort of portable process, if you will, that could be done regularly, daily. And so you know, you've had a sense of just how this could look in a daily process. But a daily practice, something that's done weekly or you know, more in a retreat setting. And so that's what I've done now with a 3-day retreat, and being able to pilot that to prove that we could do something more regularly or in an expanded way, quarterly. But you know, to answer the question more precisely, I believe it's important for us in ministry, and I use the term ministry very broadly because not everybody on the phone is clergy. We have laity. So whatever God has led you to do, I think that every day we have to have some spiritual practice. If we look at the example of Jesus Christ, he didn't just observe the weekly Sabbath. He had a daily practice of engaging in prayer and just stepping away. And we don't even know the full scope of what it was that Jesus did. The Gospels talk about him retreating for prayer, but just taking that time on a daily basis. So I think that we have to do this on a daily basis. I told you I started my life as an engineer, and so I tend to be that kind of logic-based person. I think that there's a process that allows us to sort of unwind and sets the stage for us to then be able to be reflective. So that's what the 7 R's does. It sort of doesn't say I'm going to just sit down and say, oh, reflect now. But it gives me space to stop, to rest, to unwind, and I can do that in the span of, you know, a few minutes. I can do that over the course of 3 days. So I'd like to think that the process lends itself to any implementation.
Thank you. And one other question that I can see is, what do you do when you sense a distinct difference between your context and your call?
Well, that's really a time to be discerning to the Lord of what's that about. You know, it's funny, I was talking to a person who was a lay person at the time, and he shared how he felt years and years ago a call to the ministry, pastoral ministry, but he was sort of scared of it, and so he never acted on it. And he found himself doing things like being, you know, a youth leader and leading Bible study. So he was doing all these things, And he was in one of my workshops, and in the process realized that he remembered that God had called him to pastoral ministry, and he was doing all these things because that felt safer. And he had to confront that fear and say, okay, God, I'm going to do what you've called me to do and trust you. And so this might be that opportunity to realize that leading, that maybe God is calling you to step out and trust him. And this is where I talked about that idea of recognizing how God has been faithful, to us in all of our lives. As David said, I've never seen the righteous forsaken or his seed begging bread, that even if we fall, we do not fall headlong, that God catches us with his powerful, mighty, outstretched hand. And so as God has been faithful in the past, God will be faithful in the future. And we need to trust that maybe God is calling us to step out in that faith and bring those two closer into alignment.
Deborah, I see one raised hand. I'm going to open up the line to Candace. Candace, are you still on the line?
I am.
Hi, how are
Hello.
you? Yes.
I'm finding you.
Good, thank you.
I she had Deborah, you had mentioned a couple authors that you had researched, and
Mm-hmm.
I couldn't catch the name, especially the one who um, theory of theory of practice.
Yes, theory of practice, and it's a very dense book, but a wonderful resource. Chris Argyris, Argyis, I believe. Let me make sure that I'm spelling that correctly, because that would be a real bummer if you went to look for the reference and then couldn't find it. But and 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 of course now I can't find it. So let me look at my own bookshelf. Chris
Okay.
Argyris, Argyris, and Donald Schoen, which is Schon, and the book is called Theory in Practice. The other authors that I referenced are Ronald Heifetz, Heifetz, and then also Daniel Goleman, Goleman.
Thank you so much.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your question, Candace. Are there any other questions outstanding that I did not address? If so, you can raise your hand or you can type it in the question box on the right-hand side. Okay, I do not see any additional questions. So I'd like to thank you, Deborah, for your time today and thank everyone who's joined us. I encourage you to learn more about spiritual practices for effective leadership, 7 Hours of Sanctuary. As Deborah mentioned, you can find it on judsonpress.com. And if you order online, you will receive a 20% discount. We also invite you to join our other webinars that are scheduled during the months of November and December. You can learn more about them by going onto our website and clicking on the news and notes section. Thank you again for participating and enjoy the rest of your
Yes,
day.
thank you. Thank you all.